I'm Cheryl Durst. I'm the Executive Vice President and CEO of IIDA, and this is episode 9 in our ongoing series of collective design webinars. This series is generously sponsored by Interface, and today we are going to spend a bit of time talking about community support and innovation and how design and designers exemplify humanitarian effort. We're going to talk about emotion and empathy and well-being and community involvement. Today's very thoughtful panel will engage in a discussion about leading a response, about giving back, about coming together on behalf of us all. A bit of housekeeping before I introduce our moderator. Today's program is CEU accredited by IDCEC for 1 CEU. To receive the credit, you must attend the entire webinar. Your credit will be reported within 7 business days if you registered with us with an IIDA member number. If you didn't register, please email our education team at contactceu@iida.org with either your IIDA or IDCEC numbers. And don't worry, the slide will be shown again at the end of the presentation as well if you didn't catch all the information. Okay. I am very honored to introduce the moderator for today's program. Sascha Wagner is the current president-elect of the International Board of IIDA, as well as the CEO of Huntsman. Sascha exemplifies leadership and firmly believes that the role of the built environment is to support and amplify the values of people, organizations, and communities. Sascha, good afternoon. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that introduction, and thanks to IIDA and to Interface for making this program possible. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm really glad to have such a great group of panelists with me here virtually with us today, starting with Kathleen Carey. Kathleen, welcome. Kathleen is the Firmwide Community Impact Leader at Gensler, so this topic is very close to home for her, and we look forward to hearing her perspective on this idea of community. Joining Kathleen is Jan Johnson. I've known Jan for a long time. Jan is the Vice President of Workplace Strategy for Allsteel and Gunlocke, and I think one of our industry's brilliant contributors in terms of how the workplace and the human experience are interacting. So welcome, Jan. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least, Neil Schneider with Interior Architects, Design Director and Principal with IA. Neil is also part of IA's COVID-19 recovery team, so has been intimately involved with response efforts on behalf of that firm, and we look forward to digging into that a little bit later. So thank you all three for joining us here today. And as Cheryl mentioned, we're going to be exploring how the design industry has been responding to the current COVID-19 situation, and how design can continue to play a critical role in driving change and in supporting our communities, our various levels of community. And really, when we're looking at the idea of community, there really are our own organizations. There's the design industry. The places, the communities where we live and work, and of course society in general. So lots of different levels of community, and all of them impacted by COVID-19, and perhaps our sense of community is impacted as well. So that's what I hope to explore with you all today. And we'll jump into the first question, which is really this idea of volunteering and activism. We've got so many great examples of what design firms have been doing, and designers have been doing, manufacturers have been doing in their communities to support people on the front lines and their communities in general. And we'll start with you, Kathleen. Your role at Gensler is a community impact leader. Means that you're orchestrating some of these efforts and harnessing some of these efforts globally for the firm. What have you all been doing? What kind of initiatives and activities can you share with our audience?
Well, I think like a lot of design firms, we've been jumping right in, as I know many of you did as well. We got some real inspiration early on. I think it was the first day we were actually working from home. Our co-CEOs said, we're going to double down on community impact. This is the time. for us to double down and do what we can to help our communities in this humanitarian crisis. And simultaneously with her saying that, kind of behind the scenes, all the grassroots efforts had already started. So people had brought the 3D printers home from the office and used their own personal 3D printers to start fabricating face shields and figuring out how to make ventilator splitter parts, specialty parts that hospitals were going to come to need. So, you know, we had that great inspiration from the top, but we also had this incredible grassroots effort starting. And I think as time went by, that, of course, that effort grew to about, I think we have about 36 people fabricating at home, and they became a network. So talk about an interesting community. A lot of the people who were doing this work didn't really know each other at the outset. And so they became an interesting community, sharing best practices and contributing to hospitals and healthcare facilities in about 22 different locations. But as time went on, we also saw the designers step up and be very thoughtful about what they could do in their communities. And everything from designing a coloring book with a companion piece for adults. It was originally designed for kids, and then all of us said, well, wait a minute, we would like one of those too. So we put out a coloring book called Amazing Cities from our Texas office, our Austin office, that has now been downloaded in 92 countries. So I guess people really like coloring books. And everybody wanted to do something. The one that I guess resonated the most with the design community is a project called Color Speaks out of our Seattle and Portland office. And this started as a research project about the impact of color in cities. And the individuals involved in that said, you know, this can be more than that. And they started to work with restaurants and other businesses that had been boarded up with plywood during the shutdown, and said, hey, maybe we can work with these people and do something about those facades. So they did. That's exactly what they did. They started to work with the business owners and design some great templates that could be used, and they painted the facades, and now, you know, brought a little bit of light and color to these downtown streetscapes. So we've kind of seen a full range of activities. And what we've been able to do, fortunately, is to now bring them all together, right? To share best practices all across the firm. So an idea like Color Speaks is very easily transportable into other cities. There's even an instruction book with kind of paint by number templates that goes along with it. So, you know, we continue to see people generate and feed off each other and create new communities, which is really exciting.
That's terrific. It's great to see that happening at all different scales and also broadly regionally as well. Neil, what about you guys at IA? How has this been galvanizing you around the idea of community?
You know, I think for all of us, we're starting to build our virtual communities, our local communities, our internal office communities, and I think it's such a wide range of communities that are developing. A lot of our smaller offices have donated time to food banks to go in to help in the areas of the country that need a little bit more support. Sewing masks, doing different activities, and we're tracking that through. We have what we call IA Reach as an organization internally, and we're tracking that office by office on that. We're a little bit smaller than the Gensler model, but it's nice to see people share some of those amazing innovations that they're doing, and even some of the art that they're creating. So we do an art auction every year in the Chicago office, for example, and so all of our designers are putting together art pieces to be able to donate that money back to charity. So using our different designers to kind of develop a lot of those really beautiful traits that they have at home, whether it's through knotting or painting, digital arts, even quilting. So it's really lovely to see what people's passions are at home.
Yeah, and bringing some of that personal passion to the community is really a very rewarding thing as well. So that's great to hear. And what about you, Jan, as a manufacturer? You guys have a kind of a different opportunity really to contribute.
We do, because we have a lot of different capabilities. And I'll start out with a bit of a personal story in that the president of HBF happened to be in New York just as things were really heating up, and saw some of Governor Cuomo's presentations about the challenges that they were facing and the real need for PPE. And he thought, you know, I've got sewers and we can start to fabricate things. So his teams were all over it and started to produce masks and mask covers. He went to corporate and got H&I as a larger entity involved, and we began to look at what each factory could contribute. A lot of it is about using sewing and fabrication of gowns and masks and mask covers, but we've also been able to loan some of our equipment, especially in processing time, to help with things like cutting acrylic face shields and sewing elastic onto dormant N95 respirators so that they can be reused and enter back into the supply chain. So it's been a lot around making sure we can really take advantage of what our capabilities are as a manufacturer and try to do it to scale, but also make sure that those things are happening in the local market so we understand the specifications they need and we understand what the local entities, healthcare and such in each of those areas where we have facilities are able to contribute to their local communities.
And are those opportunities coming to you, or are you guys actively seeking them out?
Once we understood that we were going to scale this thing up, it was a matter of reaching out to those local entities in each of our areas and making sure we were doing something that was relevant and met their needs and again met their specs. And so it was very much a partnership around seeking them out to make sure we were doing the right things that would actually be helpful.
Sure. And Kathleen and Neil, what about in your organizations? How are you identifying where to direct the efforts? Is it just the individual, team members that are coming up with ideas or suggestions based on their personal observations and passions, or do you have a firm-wide directive of areas you want to focus on?
I think it goes a little bit on both. I think, as an organization, we believe in our younger team members and what they bring to the table. And so we're seeing the passion come from those younger designers to really push, and the firm is then supporting them in some of those efforts. And then we do have, as I said, our larger organization through IA Reach to kind of think about those bigger buckets that we can start to kind of work with, whether it was United Way or some of the other organizations that we may start to kind of donate a little bit more of our time to. But a lot of it right now is really helping those younger individuals kind of step up and empower them.
I would say in our case, it's kind of evolved. There, as I said early on, there was a lot of grassroots effort that we then coalesced, and we started to reach out at the firm level and say, hey, tell us what you're doing, and tell us what you'd like to do. And we collected those ideas, and in about a 5-day period, we had over 100 different ideas of what people were doing. And then we started to share that. We have 50 offices, so we're able to share that across the breadth of the firm globally. And that's kind of how it has evolved for us.
That's terrific. One of the questions that had come in from participants prior to us starting was, for individuals to get involved in some of these organizations, how do they best direct their efforts? How do they find places to contribute, organizations to support? Do you guys have some links on your websites where you list the organizations you're partnering with, or places where people can find a way to contribute?
We do have a community impact page that you can source through our Gensler.com, and you can see the organizations that we're partnered with. But believe me, there is no lack of need out there. It's very easy to identify the need. If you know of a particular type of organization that you might want to work alongside, they generally have their needs pretty prominently displayed on their websites as well. So if you think you might be interested, for example, in one of our partners, the Boys and Girls Club, they'll tell you the types of things that they're interested in. So it's pretty easy, and I'm sure they would welcome your help.
Sure, and there also are organizations like Volunteer Match where you can go on websites and find places to interact with, depending on where you want to focus your efforts, and sort of an exchange for that. That's great. Want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the other piece of this, which has been the sharing of information, and I think that it's kind of been a really terrific example of our industry coming together in terms of response strategies for returning back to the workplace or back to other environments where we gather with resources and planning approaches and research, and the amount of sharing has just been incredible, both from a design firm and manufacturer, real estate professionals, the furniture industry, everyone's come together at this stage and shared. Maybe start with you, Neil. You're on that COVID-19 recovery team for IA. How are you guys participating in surveys and research, and how are you communicating and sharing best practices with others at this time?
Yeah, we've ran a lot of stuff over the last 3 months. I think it was a fire hose of knowledge and information coming in the door. And for a group at IA, our executive committee, we pulled together and said, we need to figure out a way to collect it, get it out to the right people, make sure that it's not the wash, that it's very thoughtful in our messaging and what we're looking at. So we divided up the group into the different sectors on if it's future think, if it's immediate, getting back people to their offices or their work dynamic, or if it's just some really high level behavioral thought that was coming in. So we ran a panel discussion or a webinar a while back, and you can see that on our blog posts. We've been putting out content regularly on the blog posts, collecting as much data as we can from other sources, whether they're manufacturers, whether they're other architecture firms, real estate companies, a lot of us participating in lots of webinars and sharing that content. And, we're trying to push it out as much as we possibly can, but we do want to be thoughtful. And really saying that, we weren't the first ones to jump the bandwagon and start planning this and changing that. We want to make sure that what our messages are from the firm are thoughtful to our clients, to our employees, and to the community as a whole. So, big change is happening in the world, and that's what's exciting and it's inspiring. And every day for me is to be part of those panels. We talked, Sascha, the other day about a webinar about material products and antimicrobial surfaces, and the knowledge that people are gaining right now just sitting at home it's exciting. We said it's kind of like going back into school again and just studying like nonstop. So we are sharing it all. We're looking as much as we can at what other people are doing and trying to learn from each other and develop better product together, whether they're competitors in this new world. They're no longer competitors, that we're all trying to do something really wonderful for the design community.
Yeah, it's really been a great feeling of it's sort of the Rosie the Riveter model. Everybody's jumping in and doing their part to move us forward. Jan, how is it from a manufacturer's perspective in terms of sharing best practices in this time?
Sure, it's very similar to what Neil just described. A similar process of taking in all that we're getting from lots of other sources. I think we were sensitive at first to not inundating everybody with all this stuff that was coming out, because it felt like a bit of a tsunami. But on the other hand, each time we've offered some kind of program to kind of take another step forward, it's been really well received, and we've gotten hundreds of participants. So there's obviously still a need to keep on top of this and make sure we're not missing something, or that we haven't been able to change our point of view about something because we've got new information. So we're doing exactly what Neil has described that IA is doing, and trying to sort of stay on top of what other people are saying and seeing if we can bring in a unique perspective to try to help make sense of it and to sort through it. And so as you and I talked, I think one of the things that we've been really interested in is getting a little more insight into some of the environmental psychology issues, so that we understand not only the physical environment and the things that we could do, because obviously we're in furniture, but also what is it that we can help in terms of supporting not just physical safety, but psychological safety. And so we have some points of view about that. And whenever it makes sense for me to share some of them, let me know.
Yeah, I do want to get into that topic next, actually. But before we do, I wanted to just, on this information sharing piece, ask Kathleen, how do we make sure we keep this going, post COVID even?
I would echo a lot of what Jan and Neil said in terms of the thought leadership pieces and being, trying to be thoughtful in where we put our time and resources, but knowing that there's an enormous thirst for knowledge out there. And so we produced a lot of content. I think some of the most interesting things that we have shared have to do with having offices in Asia, so who are ahead of us in terms of the recovery. And I think that's a way that we've been able to successfully share maybe some knowledge that might not be as readily accessible to others. So we actually have an office. We have offices that are reopening now. There are schools on the ground that are reopening now. What's happening there? What are they doing? What does Singapore look like these days? And so I think that's been a meaningful way for us to share.
That's awesome,
Yeah,
Kathleen.
I remember reading an article from one of your Gensler colleagues about elevators in Asia. The toothpicks on the wall was a really cool hack, right? So we're all sharing best practices that way. So well, thank you all for everything your organizations are doing in moving the conversation forward. I do want to get back to this topic of community and well-being, both physical well-being and psychological well-being, as Jan alluded to. And maybe we start with that idea. Jan, you and I were talking the other day about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and this idea of, this increased sense of urgency around the idea of community and connection and belonging. Where does the need to belong rank in the hierarchy of needs? And are we feeling more connected now or less?
Yeah, I hope it's okay to remind you all of Maslow, because I'm sure for some it's a painful topic that you just as soon forget. But basically, Maslow talked about 5 stages, and belonging is in the middle. It's right after physiological safety. In other words, I have food and shelter and water, which is pretty darn basic. From there, it gets to more psychological safety in a sense of personal safety, in addition to the physiological safety, but then belonging is number 3. And so it's a very powerful sort of thing. And I think some of the things that we've been thinking about is the social distancing and what's it going to mean. And so we're able to have some conversations with Sally Augustin, who's a well-known environmental psychologist, who shared with us that if you remember, for any of you that are really into this stuff and you've read Edward Hall, he talks about sort of concentric circles around us that have to do with the level of sort of intimacy to formality the further we get from people. And 6 feet is outside that level of intimacy, in the sense that normally when we're chatting with somebody we know well and a trusted colleague, they're probably closer to 3 to 4 feet away from us. So 6 feet changes the tone of the conversation. It becomes a much more formal conversation than we would expect it to be or need to be or want it to be. And so we talked a little bit about how that could be really disconcerting. And you add to that the fact that we're all going to have our faces covered past our noses, and we are going to miss out on all of the body language as we meet face to face, that both distancing and masking is going to cause. And so I think I'm going to be really interested in discovering how we create some workarounds and what other things can help ameliorate that. And I think Kathleen and I talked a bit about some of the things that could be super helpful to think about that could create a sense of belonging in new and different ways if it's not just coming from those personal interactions.
Sure, and then of course we have the digital interaction that we're having right now, and Neil, you and I talked about this idea that in the near future we'll return to public spaces again, but many of us will continue to work from home for prolonged periods and perhaps indefinitely for some portion of our time, and this isn't the same experience, right? So in terms of sense of community, in some ways there's some real positives, and in other ways there's some real challenges with this electronic communications. What do you think about about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me the way that our virtual communities have started to build so strong, and those face interactions are now on a screen. We've been seeing software that we've had for years and years actually used to what it was designed for. And so working with different companies now to develop virtual spaces that allow for creative thought and ideation to happen. So, there's a great company out there called Mural that does like a lot of visioning and online kind of collaborations. So we're starting to see this world of, through Zoom or Teams or collaborative software start to really come to the forefront, and people starting to share really great ideas and build this virtual community together. But we're humans, and we're going to come back to a space where we need to be around other people. And you see it in New York with the circles that are being drawn in the parks to get social distancing to happen. That's a short-term goal. We're going to get to something, and we're going to evolve. And, I was reading Tim Brown's Change by Design the other day just to refresh myself, because we all have to kind of get that that energy back. And, you know, as designers and leaders, it's our job to kind of come up with these amazing solutions and think outside the box and push our boundaries. And so we're going to have to do that both virtually, and then we're going to have to figure out how to get ourselves back together in a room, because great innovation happens with people together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I
that
think
belonging.
we'd much rather be sitting around a real round table right now than a virtual one.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, as you mentioned, it allows us to connect with others at distance, perhaps more frequently than we have before. And we're certainly seeing that in our organization, this need to be part of a greater whole and to be connected. In some ways, it's enabled through the technology, and that's not a bad thing, but we need more than that, I think. And so I think all of us in our organizations are trying to do things to stay connected at this moment. And Kathleen, what are you guys doing at Gensler to do that as a community?
Well, this is, you know, kind of right up my alley. So, and Jan and I were talking about this yesterday, that, you know, people nowadays want their work to have meaning and purpose. And that's, you know, widely reported in the research. And it's especially true, I think, with respect to the millennials, but also with this new generation, Gen Z. You know, they're the ones that are talking about purpose before paycheck, which is, you know, quite amazing. So they want to have a sense of belonging that Jan, you know, was talking about, and a sense of purpose, that their work really has meaning, that they're not just a cog in the machine. And so I think, from my perspective, that's one of the roles that community outreach plays for an organization. Having that shared purpose that we are going to help our community in a way that really creates impact, in a way that's really meaningful, can serve multiple purposes. It's of course, first and foremost, to help the community, to help the organization, but it also has this wonderful impact of bringing people together for this shared goal. You know, maybe we can raise enough money to buy 225 pizzas for the Boys and Girls Club. Maybe we can, you know, get these murals up and going in another city besides Seattle and Portland. And it provides energy. And again, this overriding sense of purpose that people are looking for. So I think that really helps connect us.
Yeah, and I think that I wanted to jump in with sort of a question related to IIDA in that regard. I mean, we're really an organization that's about bringing people together to be a connector in our design community. And I just wanted to ask all of you guys that you know, programs like this and information sharing and other things the organization is doing are all geared around that idea of the design community and keeping us together. What is that working for you? Is there anything else the organization could be doing, or something we could be doing better to connect us? Is there what would you like to see IIDA do in terms of our role in this community? And if you don't have an answer and you think everything's being done perfectly, that's fine as well.
Well, I would say, because I'm not a designer and I'm not an architect, I was really quite impressed to be invited to the panel. And I applaud IIDA for saying, hey, maybe somebody who's not doing this day to day and has a different role and has a different perspective could add something to this conversation. And so I would say, you know, that would be really valuable to me, to hear different perspectives. And I think IIDA is doing a good job.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I think we're all looking for different perspectives and inputs these days as well. I think that, you know, our work by nature is becoming a little bit more cross-disciplinary, and we're listening to many more voices, including scientists, at this time. Let's get back to that in a minute, but I wanted to just follow up, Jan, on what you were saying about this idea of emotional well-being, and so we talked a little bit about how it is now with this digital technology, both connecting us and at the same time keeping us at a distance. But as we get back to gathering again, I want to, you know, I attended your program last year about unwritten rules, and I wanted to follow up on that a little bit. If you guys haven't caught that, I think on Allsteel's website you can get a recap and some links to this idea where Jan is exploring really the connectors within organizations that are not, you know, the business plan and not the org structure, but really how the unwritten rules are guiding what human behavior is like in organizations and also in the built environment. And I'm going to quote you right now, Jan, where you say, cultural neuroscience tells us that the brain is not fixed, but is constantly changing in response to social environments. And I couldn't help when I reread that to think about how much is changing in our social environment now, and how our brains are reacting. So being safe and feeling safe, not quite the same thing. How is that going to change how we respond to each other emotionally as we return?
You know, I think what we've said about unwritten rules is it's basically the manifestation of the culture. If you think about organizations, they sort of have two parts: the formal side, which is org charts and mission statements and policies and job descriptions and all that sort of thing. But really running deep inside the organization is a sort of operating system, or these unwritten rules of the things that we unconsciously, perhaps quite often, agree that it's going to drive our behavior, that we're going to do things this way as opposed to that way. That we're going to reward these kinds of interactions and maybe, you know, shun the people that do the things that we don't want them to do. So it's basically, we're all back in high school. You know, one of my colleague, Jeff Leitner, found a quote from Frank Zappa, of all people. For those of you that are too young to know who he is, he was this very odd, but really brilliant, innovative musician. And one of the things he said was, life is like high school with money, right? And so this is sort of how we operate, whether we realize it or not. And so, yes, I think we're constantly shifting our unwritten rules to kind of match the situation and to figure out how we're going to deal with it. So we do expect to see lots of unwritten rules having to sort of be put aside or reinvented as we go. But I think the good news about it is that it's a collective effort. We do this with our social entities inside those organizations. So some of the things that I think are super positive is that this is causing, from everything I'm hearing anecdotally, a lot more connectivity between parts of the organization. You know, Kathleen has talked about how people are spending more time talking to each other and coordinating and doing lots of things collectively. Neil said the same thing. I think our connections are actually getting tighter, and that's, to me, a really positive thing, even in this situation. But I think it's also something I want to share with the design community at large, which is why you heard us speak about this last year, and we're going to continue to do this in the next few months, is how do we as designers also get ourselves familiar with this idea of the sort of formal organization and the informal organization, and the opportunity unwritten rules have to help us understand what's actually the real entity that we're dealing with, not just the things that leadership tells us sort of aspirationally, and how does design in its power help reconcile both the formal and the informal parts of the organization so they really are aligned rather than potentially at cross purposes. And that the design reflects both those things. And we're not only listening to where leadership is trying to take the organization, but we're also listening to the workers as to where they're at and how they perceive some of the things that those aspirational statements. So how do we make those both come together? And so I think there's some things we'll learn about in the short term, but yes, please, if you have more interest in this, we can send you to some existing resources, and we'll start to publish a schedule of some of the things we're going to be doing more concurrently. And also share things like some of the question sets we've developed to try to approach leadership about some of the things that we think we need to know more about, and also the kinds of questions we can ask, you know, the rank and file to some extent to get their reactions to those things, and to make sure we're checking in on getting reality checks, I guess is the best way to put it, about not only the functional requirements of the organization, but how that culture manifests in reality.
Yes, and it makes me think about the emotional impacts that we're all going to be feeling as we're entering this new sort of world order of signage everywhere, and constraints about where you're allowed to move and things you're allowed to touch and how far away from things you need to be, and how that's being conveyed both formally and informally is really interesting. And I'm hopeful that we will continue to share best practices as an industry, to figure out what's best and how that's impacting, you know, people emotionally and psychologically.
Yeah, and I hope when we do that we're really participative, because I think if those things come down on high, it's a different feeling than if the people who have those concerns and can openly share those concerns are part of the process. Because then they feel like they're being heard, and they can also become evangelists to the rest of the organization about the rationale and the logic and the participation that went into the development of those things. So all about high levels of participation.
And of course, the physical wellness, you know, is another big piece of it, right? We talked about the emotional well-being, but I think, you know, we've been seeing this emergence of a focus on human wellness in the built environment for many years now, and you know, with LEED and then eventually the WELL standard being more and more prominent and prevalent, and so I would ask Neil, maybe are you, is that your primary focus now? Is human well-being at the forefront of is it the biggest lens through which you see your work, and is it changing sort of how designers see themselves in their role?
Yeah, I think there's been a big pivot. And I guess I shouldn't say a big pivot. I think there's a pivot around well-being and caring for each other and the empathy for your other employees. So I think the conversation is talking to the other person, figuring out how they feel. Before you run, I'm a hugger, I'd run up and give somebody a hug. So I have to understand those limitations on certain things because I'm going to want to do that. But understanding those needs for that. And when we look at the new work environment, it's trying to build around the space to say, okay, what's going to make people comfortable in this healthier environment that we're trying to look at? And for a long time, it was all about how do we give that hospitality feel to the office and to the spaces that we're building. I still think that there's going to be that warmth and that comfort that's there, because we built that to make people feel comfortable at their home as well as in the built environment. But there will be an increased sanitation or well-being in those offices so that when people return, they feel safer, almost sometimes in their home, because they probably are not cleaning as much as, right now is probably a bad example. We're all cleaning like crazy, but going back in, they want to feel protected and secured. So I think that's going to affect everything, the way that people arrive into buildings or get to buildings, how they navigate through the space. And those ties need to be meaningful, like Jan was talking about, is you can't just draw a whole bunch of circles and put signs up. It's about really making sure people feel comfortable and they enjoy that experience. Otherwise, they're not going to come use it. They want to be around those really beautiful spaces that inspire them every day. They get them thinking about the future of what things can be. There's some planning philosophies we need to be working through, but we want to build something beautiful for people.
And are any of you, I mean, I'll ask you as a manufacturer as well, Jan, but in your design firms, looking at this idea of physical wellness and bringing on additional expertise, working with scientists perhaps, or you know, partnering? Are there new collaborations, or how are you, you know, incorporating research that's out there to give it a more, you know, a deeper foundation in scientific research as opposed to just human behavioral thinking in design?
I think I'll jump in. I think Jan probably is a good one on here, but about a year ago, we one of our strategists out in the Bay Area was researching the neuroscience around people, and that was a big topic for a few years. And you know, the amount of people that are on the spectrum and you know that are having challenges going into the offices, and we published a blog piece a little bit on it, but it went into this idea of now we're understanding we can tap into this population that may not have been comfortable going into spaces before. So there's this entire new group of individuals that we can start to kind of work with and build very comfortable spaces to really elevate our companies, which is interesting to start to dive into. So working with some of those scientists out in that area and doctors to understand what does that really mean. I think we're not there yet with the situation that's happening now. I think that that's really evolving, but it's interesting to even look back on what we've been talking about for the last how many years about really caring about people's mental state.
Mm-hmm. So a whole new way of a cross-disciplinary approach then.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Jan, what about you? How are you guys incorporating that scientific research in your product development roadmap, for example?
Yeah, no, great question. I think it's coming up in a lot of different areas. You know, we're certainly influenced by materiality and some of the, you know, the current concerns, and taking that into the future and understanding how we can continue to improve on that so things are more, have more longevity, I'd say, as well as still providing a tremendous level of comfort. So we're trying to understand how to balance those things. I'd say the other is, again, a little bit of Sally's input is, we know that rectilinear shapes, for example, tend to connote easier to clean and that sort of thing. And yet we find it comforting to have rounded, softer shapes and things that aren't quite so rectilinear. And so again, how do we sort of balance what we understand about those things and people's reaction to them, and try to be judicious about where we use each kind of strategy and what it gets us. I think the third thing is a little bit of this idea around adaptability. I think the number one thing that we can help contribute along with our design professional friends is how do we create an environment that can continue to be morphable, to be flexible, so that people themselves can even self-perform some of the things that make it more comfortable or make it more relevant, or that help the organization to be able to continue to adapt over time. We're learning a lot right now. Things change in this current environment. It feels like every day is a week long because we keep learning new information. And the things I read just that were published in April feel a little dated to me now. And I think everybody probably has that experience. So things are moving at light speed right now. And I think that's going to continue for a long time, frankly. And so how do we design what we're designing so that it includes a lot of what Neil talked about in terms of hospitality and beauty and comfort and all those things, but how do we also build in the ability for it to continue to adapt over time? Because we can't design something, freeze it in amber, and then expect it to be relevant for the next 7 or 8 years. That's just not where our heads are at, or our organizations are at, or where the world is at. And so how do we also come up with things that help you look for those opportunities to continue to flex and change?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think your point about user control and the idea to have some sort of participatory experience is going to be especially challenged now as we return into spaces that are so prescribed and so confined in terms of what you can and cannot do, and how you can and cannot interact with people and the environment, just for safety's sake, right? So there's going to be a long road back. But your point's well taken about organizations needing to morph and change and evolve and learn. And Neil, you mentioned a number of different ways you guys are working differently together and using technology differently together. And Kathleen, I'd like to ask you how you, from a community involvement standpoint, how is this experience changing how you guys are looking at community involvement, maybe on a permanent basis? How is it changing your organization?
Well, I certainly think that, as all of us have said, that things are continuing to evolve and change at just a breakneck pace. Every day we learn something new, and something new comes up. But Sascha, one of the things you and I were talking about is that some things haven't changed. And so I think we need to be mindful of those things too. So, we were always engaged in communities at Gensler. Our mission statement is around creating a better world through the power of design. So we always had a high engagement factor around our communities, and that hasn't changed. The mode in which we might be able to deliver to these organizations has changed, but their need hasn't changed. And in fact, their need has probably become more dire. We were talking about homelessness, and we were talking about food insecurity and access to quality health care and access to education. None of that has changed. And in fact, it's probably gotten worse through the pandemic. So what's our responsibility, not just as our organization, but as an industry? We've got the capability, we've got incredible talent and desire for purpose-driven work. So there's an opportunity there for us to step up as an industry and do more for the underserved communities. And I think that's really going to be our challenge, because we're going through an economic recession, and times are difficult. So I think that's really our challenge, and we're going to have to figure out creative ways to do that. One of the things that has surprised and maybe delighted me just a bit is how much you can do remotely, how much can be virtual, even in terms of community outreach. So, and how much you can do at a socially distanced level. And we're not going to be this way forever. Things will change. So I think, we have to be able to think further than a year or two into the future when we think about what we're going to change, what we want to change, and what we really want to retain.
Yeah, that's great. A great perspective. Thank you. And it actually leads into what, as I'm keeping an eye on our time here, what I wanted to sort of wrap up with, this idea of the silver lining, this idea of future hope, right? You've mentioned some positive outcomes already in learnings, but to me, it's just, so the idea that design is an optimistic endeavor. I think designers by nature are optimists, and we envision a future state that is improved, that is better, beneficial to society and those we serve. And so I think that all of us are hopeful that some good is going to come out of what we're learning in this crisis mode right now. We've touched on a lot of different things that you guys are doing in your organizations and things you're learning in your organizations. So I want to ask you, maybe in the context of, yes, we're going to have a recovery, and yes, we're going to focus on the economics and getting back on our feet and ending the recession you mentioned, Kathleen, but that can't come at the expense of the environment. It can't come at the expense of social equity. It can't come at the expense of human health. So how do we make sure we learn from this, not slide backwards, but actually move forward in a positive direction? What's your hope, and what's your priority, for the future out of this experience with COVID-19? Anyone can go. It's a loaded question, but what do you hope that we'll take away from this?
I think in large part, the thing that makes me most optimistic is the design thinking process. Is that just inherently, by the virtue of our training and our predisposition to this kind of, thinking, that we have an opportunity to be very much a part of the solution and to exercise our brains, even as things are coming at us at a quick pace. And so I think just that capability is something we have to continue to hang on to and apply to our best ability. I think the other is, again, I'm a huge proponent of high levels of participation. And I think the fact that this has sort of taken us completely off course with where we thought we'd be right now is sort of opportunistic, in that we get to some extent, rethink it, to reimagine the directions we're going in, to reimagine what's possible, and to be able to sort of think, instead of continuing to just make incremental improvements, to think about leaps in what we can accomplish. And so I'm excited about the opportunity, even though it's daunting, to think about making larger progressions in the things that we think are important.
Yeah, I agree completely with Jan there. We were given, whether we like it or not, a white piece of paper to start over. And I think that is amazing as designers, to have a pen and a paper to kind of rethink the way that we're doing. We talked a lot about learning and development of our own personal kind of well-being, but I find myself rereading books, like I said, like the creative brain, and the way that design can change the world out there. And so I find myself watching documentaries, reading more books about it, and then inspiring myself to say, I need to do more and I need to do different things. So I think going into the future, I hope I fall back and say, okay, I'm going to go into my bad habits that I did before, and not stay as focused on some of the knowledge that's coming in, and be able to bring that back to the personal connections with my clients, because we have a gift as designers. We're problem solvers, and with that speed of knowledge and what we're learning both in the virtual world and the physical environments that we build is so amazing right now. And I don't want anybody to forget that. I want them to think about how can they take what they've learned and push us even further, because that leap, as Jan described, we're going to get a big one, and it's going to be pretty amazing to see what comes from our design teams.
I also think that I agree with what both of my co-panelists have said, and I'm hopeful. And one of the things I hope that we're able to leverage and capitalize on is the speed at which we've been able to form new networks, and hear thinking that we had not perhaps considered before, and come up with solutions that perhaps we had not considered before, because we're talking to different sources, right? We're sharing more. Sascha, you pointed that out. We're sharing much more broadly than perhaps we would have before, just because of the nature of this particular crisis and because of the nature of this industry. So I'm hopeful that if we can continue to perpetuate that and quickly create new networks, that will help us to get to the place that Neil was describing.
That's great. I think all three of you are spot on, and it's a really hopeful message that we're going to be able to use this as an opportunity to maybe rewrite the way we interact with one another, and rewrite the way we interact with the built environment as well, and actually come out with having learned, perhaps relearned, some of the most important aspects of our role as designers and design professionals, and the contribution we can make to society by being part of that reinvention, being part of that innovation. And it certainly fills me with hope that all of you are so engaged and optimistic as well, and are taking this as a challenge to improve and to move forward. One of the questions that's come in from the audience is, how do we convey this message to our clients as they're going to be worried about their bottom line in the near future. Any one of you want to respond to that?
You know, I'll respond just quickly by saying, you guys might be familiar with this, in the most recent Gallup employee engagement poll, it showed us that only 35% of our workforce in the US is actively engaged, but we know that engaged employees are more productive. They produce better business results across industries, across geographies, across company sizes, and that is true in good times and in bad. So if you can use some of the things we've been talking about, this engagement, this network, this working to better the lot of others who are less fortunate, that will help your employee base become more engaged, and that'll be good for your business. So to me, it seems like it shouldn't be too much of a hard sell.
Yeah.
I think, go ahead.
Thanks. We were a sponsor of some research a while ago into what it is that science shows us is correlated to knowledge worker productivity. Several of you are familiar with this, but I would just reinforce that the number one thing that correlates to knowledge worker productivity is social cohesion amongst teams. As a matter of fact, the top 6 are about teams. And so I would remind our clients that we now know what it is that matters in terms of effectiveness, and it's the connections we have as humans. And so I think that's our opportunity, is to remind them that it isn't always about the bottom line, and or that those behaviors that support productivity also tend to reflect, as for example, Gensler's research shows, that it correlates to financial performance. So even if you're doing it for all the wrong reasons, do it, because even if it's coming from a place of greed, it will matter. So
it does.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. I think one of the things that you look at is empathy and modeling the behaviors that you want to see. So as a leader or as a designer, if you're modeling a certain behavior in front of your clients of what you think the future needs to be, and that it's about creative thought, why we're doing what we're doing, they buy into that. Like, that is, like, if you're compassionate and you're staying true to what it means, we'll figure it out as a group. And I think that's going to be the biggest conversation, because when we've started working with cross teams or our dynamic teams across the globe, when we're talking with them, there's compassion. You know that everybody's coming to the table to be put their A game out there. They're not going there just to be on the conference call just because. They're trying to design amazing new products or new ways of thinking for our clients. And we're all rolling up our sleeves together. Even with our clients, we're rolling up our sleeves and saying, okay, we're going to let you behind the curtain here, and we're going to build this together, because we're all discovering at the same time. So model, I would say the biggest one, just model that behavior.
And tremendous opportunity to partner with clients, right?
Yes.
Absolutely. I think our clients are going through the same experience, and they're realizing both the benefit of this forced connection that we've all been experienced, right? This virtual coming together. There have been, as you all have said, some really good improvements in the way we communicate, in the way we feel connected as a community in our organizations and more broadly. Leveraging technology, all of that, quicker to develop ideas. That's all really powerful. But I think our clients have also experienced the shortcomings of being virtual collaborators only. And I think the power of place, the idea that when we come together in physical environments, that it's not just about the physical tools we would have at our disposal, but the idea that places convey values and places convey ethos, and that is what brings us together in the built environment. And that's true for public spaces, but it's also true for offices and the connection to brands, right, in organizations. And so that's the reminder to our clients that's the why. The coming together in spaces is about bringing people together who share values. And I don't think any of us know where the balance is going to lie between the virtual and the real, and what the real world will look like, the spaces we'll create. But I'm glad that you guys and your organizations are fighting the good fight to explore all of that, to share more information, to be part of this great design community. I want to thank all of you for participating today. and sharing your perspectives. All really great points, and we appreciate you sharing your time with us today. I also want to thank our sponsor Interface for supporting this program. Everyone at IIDA, of course, IIDA staff has been terrific in putting these. This is the 9th panel discussion we've had in this series, and so thank you for making that happen, and for IIDA continuing to be a great connector of our design community. We just have the CEU information on the screen. If you are trying to get course approval for this, the codes and the email address are there. Hopefully this was a valuable experience. I want to thank everyone who joined us here today. It's been great, and again, thanks to our panelists. You guys are terrific, and I appreciate you sharing your time and perspective with everyone today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sascha.
Thank you. Thanks, Sascha.
Happy to do it.
All right, I think that brings us to the end of the program, and I hope all of you stay safe and well, and continue to contribute to the road into the future, however that may take shape. So thank you again.